Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining in remotely, and thank you to the organizers for arranging this really exciting workshop. Today, I'm going to be talking about the utility of remotely sensed soil moisture in predicting fire ignitions across the Western United States. The title of this work is Microwave Retrievals of Soil Moisture Improve Grassland Wildfire Predictions. This is also the main result of the presentation as well, not surprisingly. This is a collaborative work by myself, Robert Powell, Aleda Trevino, Kagan McColl, and Peter Hybers, all of whom are at Harvard University. And I got down this avenue of research because I was finding that remotely sensed soil moisture was really critical in predicting agricultural water stress. And it really added significant predictive skill when predicting crop yields. And this led me to think more broadly about how we're using remotely sensed soil moisture to characterize the drought response of vegetation. And as I'm going to talk about today, I think can be related to wildfire sciences as well. And I'm really excited to hear your feedback and answer questions. So it's widely known that fuel moisture content is critical when predicting fire occurrence and severity. When estimating fuel moisture content or fuel dryness across large spatial scales, it's common to use atmospheric variables. Atmospheric variables often reflect what's happening at the surface. They're also widely and easily measured historically. In retrospective studies, for example, an atmospheric variable called vapor pressure deficit has been found to be more correlated with burned area than other atmospheric properties like temperature or drought indices like PDSI, KBDI, or reanalysis-based estimates of soil moisture. This atmospheric term called vapor pressure deficit is presumably related to how much water is in the fuels, because it captures the evaporative demand of the atmosphere. More specifically, the vapor pressure deficit can conceptually be thought of as the atmosphere's efficiency at evaporating water. If it's high, that means the atmosphere is hot and dry and can very efficiently wick away water from the surface. Whereas if the vapor pressure deficit is low, the atmosphere has a low efficiency at evaporating water. So often vapor pressure deficit is used to characterize the atmosphere's demand for water. While this is very clearly related to dead fuel moisture content, live fuel moisture content may depend on other variables. And that's specifically because plant water stress often depends on both the demand of water from the atmosphere and the supply of water in the root zone. And so in this diagram, I've labeled the root zone soil moisture, so that's the water that's available to roots, as the supply of water. And again, this vapor pressure deficit, this atmospheric variable, as the atmosphere's demand for water. I often think about stress as being when there's an imbalance between how much water is available and how much water is demanded. So it's this imbalance between supply and demand of water resources that leads to plant water stress. And this has been kind of my approach when modeling agricultural yields using remotely sensed soil moisture data. Now, these two variables, vapor pressure deficit and soil moisture, are not independent. They are coupled at the land surface through land-atmosphere interactions. But what's really important to note is that they're not always in equilibrium, and that's shown here in this bottom plot. This is a two-dimensional histogram of soil moisture and vapor pressure deficit conditions that occurred over the Western United States from 2015 to 2018 during the fire season. On the x-axis, I have soil moisture. On the y-axis, I've plotted the vapor pressure deficit. And then the color represents the probability of those joint conditions occurring, with the darker colors indicating that it's more probable. What you can see is that vapor pressure deficit and soil moisture are clearly anti-correlated, but while these variables are correlated, they're not perfectly correlated. And so this leads to the question, can knowing the soil moisture add additional information? We know that plant water stress often depends on this imbalance between supply and demand, and the atmosphere is not necessarily reflecting what's happening at the surface. And so the research objective of this work was to assess the utility of using daily remotely sensed soil moisture in combination with vapor pressure deficit to retrospectively predict fire ignitions across the Western United States. Again, this is an observation-based study, so I used both ground and satellite-based observations over the Western United States from 2015 to 2018. The fire ignition data was from the USGS. Specifically, I looked at 1,907 fires from 3 different plant functional types, including grasslands, shrublands, and evergreen needle-leaf forests. The distribution of these fires is shown on the plot to the right, with grasslands in green, shrublands in orange, and evergreen needle-leaf forests in blue. And I focused on the fire season, which was defined by myself as June, July, and August. And what you can see here, I've also plotted a histogram of relative fire occurrences throughout the year, and the majority of fires for all 3 plant functional types occur in these 3 months. To characterize the soil moisture, I used data from the Soil Moisture Active Passive Satellite. This satellite was launched in 2015 and provides soil moisture data at an approximate spatial resolution of 9 kilometers every 3 days. SMAP uses an L-band passive radiometer to measure soil moisture, so it only really captures the top 5 centimeters of soil. And so I'm interested in what's available to plants, though, and so I used a simple hydrologic model to take those near surface observations and estimate a deeper root zone soil moisture. Specifically, I just applied a recursive exponential filter to those near surface observations. And then to characterize the atmosphere's demand, I used maximum daily vapor pressure deficit from weather stations that's been gridded to a 4-kilometer resolution every day. So the data is daily, and this data is from a data set called PRISM. And then to assess to quantify the predictive skill of soil moisture and vapor pressure deficit, I used receiver operating characteristic curves, or ROC curves. ROC curves summarize the ability of a binary warning signal to anticipate an event. So in this case, the binary warning signal is either based on vapor pressure deficit or soil moisture, and the event is the fire ignition. So I'm going to quickly talk through how to construct a ROC curve for soil moisture. First, you would calculate a binary warning signal from the soil moisture observations. So you would set a threshold and say, if the soil moisture was below the threshold, that indicates a warning. If it was above the threshold, that indicates no warning. And you'd calculate the true positive rate, so the number of fires that occurred when soil moisture was below that threshold, divided by the total number of fires to make it a rate. And then you would calculate the false positive rate, so the number of times soil moisture was below that threshold and no fire occurred, divided by the number of days to make it a rate. In a ROC curve, the beauty of a ROC curve is that that threshold varies. In this case, I varied it from the minimum possible soil moisture up to the maximum possible soil moisture, or the porosity of the soils. And then what a ROC curve, to construct a ROC curve, you take those different true positive and false positive rates and plot them against each other for a whole range of thresholds. And that's shown in this diagram. Here, the false positive rate is on the x-axis, the true positive rate is on the y-axis, and it's plotted for various thresholds, actually making a curve. If the true positive rate equals the false positive rate, that's shown in the red dashed line, that indicates that your explanatory variable is a random classifier, meaning that it has 0 predictive skill. And you can see the area under the curve is equal to 0.5. If the explanatory variable is a perfect classifier, which is shown in purple, the true positive rate is always equal to 1, and the associated area under the curve is equal to 1. So as the area under the curve goes from 0.5 to 1, that indicates there's increasing predictive skill of the explanatory variable. And so the first thing I did is I constructed ROC curves for vapor pressure deficit and soil moisture independently. And that's shown in these 3 plots. Now, remember, I have 1 ignition point per site. And so I've grouped the sites by plant functional type in order to construct these ROC curves. Again, the false positive rate is shown on the x-axis. The true positive rate is shown on the y-axis. I've plotted up ROC curves for soil moisture, which is shown in blue, for vapor pressure deficit, which is shown in red. The number of sites within each plant functional type is shown in the top left-hand corner of the plot. And then the associated area under the curve is also printed on the plot. One thing to notice is that soil moisture and vapor pressure deficit are both, they both have predictive skill. And so the area under the curve is greater than 0.5 for grasslands, shrublands, and evergreen needle-leaf forests. If we were to compare the predictive skill of vapor pressure deficit and soil moisture independently, what you'd find is that vapor pressure deficit does have more predictive skill across all three of the plant functional types compared to soil moisture. So that area under the curve is larger for vapor pressure deficit. But as I alluded to in the introduction, it's really this interaction between vapor pressure deficit and soil moisture that leads to plant water stress. Also, the atmosphere may not be a reflection of what's happening at the land surface because they're not always in equilibrium. So this leads me to the question, if the vapor pressure deficit is high, does knowing the soil moisture improve wildfire ignition predictability? To answer this question, I performed a subsetting procedure. Basically, I determined the threshold of vapor pressure deficit in which it was no longer informative. So I said, at which vapor pressure deficit does knowing the vapor pressure deficit lead to an area under the curve equal to 0.5? So when does the true positive rate and the false positive rate equal one another? And I've labeled the high vapor pressure deficit on this plot in the bottom. On the x-axis, this is the days since January 1st, 2015. The left y-axis shows the soil moisture. The right y-axis shows the vapor pressure deficit. I've indicated when the fire occurred, and I've also labeled the high vapor pressure deficit threshold, in which knowing the vapor pressure deficit above that provides no additional predictive skill. Interestingly, the vapor pressure deficit for each summer, in this case, exceeds that high threshold, though you can see the soil moisture is anomalously low right before that fire. Now, this is one fire, and the question is, does this pattern hold across all ignition sites? So I selected the ignitions that occur when vapor pressure deficit exceeds this high threshold, and then I assessed the predictive power of soil moisture on this subset of data when vapor pressure deficit was no longer informative. And here are the results from that subsetting procedure. In summary, soil moisture does provide additional predictive skill when vapor pressure deficit is no longer informative. And so here on the x-axis, I have vapor pressure deficit and soil moisture, so the two explanatory variables. On the y-axis, I have the area under the receiver operating characteristic curve. Remember, if it's equal to 0.5, that means it's no longer informative. And then each box, the color of each box represents its plant functional type. So grasslands are green, shrublands are orange, evergreen needle-leaf forests are blue. The boxes themselves represent the areas from that subsetting procedure, but I've bootstrapped the procedure in order to understand the uncertainty in that subsetting. So the boxes themselves represent the areas from the bootstrapping. I used 1,000 realizations. What you can see is that for vapor pressure deficit, by design, the area under the curve is equal to 0.5 approximately. And that's because I've set that threshold so that vapor pressure deficit was non-informative. Now, if I use that same subset of data and I assess the predictive power of soil moisture that's shown in the 3 box plots to the right, what you can see is soil moisture does provide additional predictive skill. It provides the most predictive skill in grasslands, and then shrublands, and then lastly, evergreen needle-leaf forests. And this indicates that there is additional distinct information in the soil moisture not reflected in the atmosphere. I also applied the same procedure to a typical drought index, the Keach-Byram Drought Index, which is often used to emulate soil moisture in wildfire studies. What I found is that there's no predictive skill in this Keach-Byram Drought Index, no added predictive skill beyond vapor pressure deficit in grasslands and shrublands, but it seems the drought index seems to approximate soil moisture well in forested ecosystems. So now I'm just going to provide some quick conclusions. First, soil moisture does add predictive skill beyond what's available from vapor pressure deficit. It adds the most predictive skill in grasslands compared to forests. And then there are some outstanding questions. Why are forests performing? Why is the added skill less for forests compared to grasslands? Maybe soil moisture from SMAP isn't actually capturing what's in the root zone, and how can we better improve that? And lastly, can this framework be applied to measurements of live fuel moisture content or remotely sensed vegetation water content to really nail down the processes that are controlling fuel moisture content and then linking them to fire ignition. Thank you so much for listening. And again, I really look forward to feedback.